There was no copper actually within miles of the mountain, even though copper exists in Sinai in abundance in some parts. Others said this clearly was from the burning of plants to produce alkali. Quite why they would want to produce alkali, nobody really knew, but the more they tested it, the more they found that there was no plant residue there at all. And in fact, if they were going to have a temple for the burning of plants, they actually would have done better down in the valleys where there were more trees, not 2,600 feet up a mountain. So for want of any other explanation, it was decided that the white powder and the stones were perhaps associated with a sacrificial rite. They're clinging at straws here all the time, trying to work out what on earth this was. This is probably animal sacrifice. Well, as pointed out by somebody who wasn't even the brightest member of the team, this was an Egyptian temple. There is nothing anywhere in history which says that the Egyptians ever used animal sacrifice for anything. It wasn't part of their religious structure at all. They tested the powder, they winnowed it in the breeze, they did everything they could. There was not a bone, a chip, a stone, a piece of plant, a piece of skin, anything in this powder. And it was described as being hard-packed talcum powder, which was impalpable to touch and just blew away in the breeze the moment you flicked it into the air. Petrie wrote, "Though I searched these ashes in dozens of instances, winnowing them in a breeze, I never found a fragment of bone, skin, plant, or anything else." So some of the mysterious powder was sent back to Britain for analysis and examination. The results, for what they were never actually published. When people went back to have a look at the rest of the powder, and they reckoned there was about 50 tons of this, it had all, of course, been left a victim to the desert winds and erosion and rainfall and whatever, and that was the end of that. What became apparent, however, when checking out other inscriptions at the temple, was that this mufkuts, this powder, had something to do with what the Mesopotamians called highwood firestone. It's the same thing. Mufkuts turned out to be highwood firestone. They called it the sacred Shem Anna, from which derived, of course, the biblical word manna. And this is the importance of the word bread that kept appearing through the thing. There was some tie-up between this powder and the Shem Anna of the Mesopotamians. Light, the word light was always there. Whenever Shem Anna was mentioned, whenever mufkuts or highwood firestone was mentioned, the symbol for light was always there alongside it. It was decided, and it turns out probably quite correctly, that this mufkut was exactly the same powder that the book of Exodus actually talks about. It tells us about powder. It tells us about the Israelites being fed with a particular powder at that time. It tells about the importance of manufacturing something called showbread for the tabernacle and the altar of the temple. Showbread is exactly the same as show manna, and Shem Anna is exactly what the Mesopotamians used to call it. It's the same thing. But the book of Exodus tells us that the guy who made the showbread for Moses' tabernacle was a guy called Bezaleel. Now, Bezaleel, it goes to great pains to tell us, was a goldsmith and a master craftsman. So this fellow has got the instructions, and they're laid down in the Bible for us to read, to make candlesticks, to make golden bowls, to make platters, to make all the ornaments for the Ark of the Covenant, and to make this bread, the goldsmith. Master craftsman is a particularly important word, and the more I looked for this definition, master craftsman, the more I found, going back and back and back in time. The definition exists way back to about 4000 BC. These were the great Vulcans, the texts tell us. The master craftsmen were the great Vulcans. They were the people in charge of the furnaces. They were the people who made the highwood firestone. So as for the crucible and the conical stones and the tanks and the tables and all of the equipment at Sinai, it was actually determined by the Petrie team that this temple was clearly a laboratory. So the report went back to London. And I began by telling you what they didn't tell us. What they'd found was the alchemical workshop of the Pharaoh Akhenaten and of the 18 dynasties of pharaohs before him. A temple laboratory where the furnace smoked and roared, just as the book of Exodus tells us, in the production of the highwood firestone, the Shemana. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. The smoke ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the mountain quaked greatly. That's what it tells us. Prior to that, it came to pass that when the sun went down, it was dark, and behold, there was a smoking furnace. A burning lamp passed between the pieces. The burning bush seen by Moses, which was a fire, a blaze, exploded, but was not consumed, and an angel came out of it. If you think about it, it's pretty well identical to the experiment that David Hudson did with his pencil. The blaze of light. It had no effect on the object within it. It's the same story. In Exodus, we read that Moses took the golden calf. We're now on the mountain. The Israelites had made a golden calf. He burnt it in the fire and ground it to a powder. Now, nobody has actually queried these words, it seems to me, but if you burn gold in a fire, you get molten gold. You don't actually get powder. But it tells us that he burnt the gold in the fire and turned it into white powder. This was exactly the process of a Shemana furnace, as the Egyptian records tell us. And that's precisely what was going on at this temple. They were actually making this stuff. 50 tons of it. Moses' own great-grandfather was the Pharaoh Thutmose III. Thutmose III had reorganized the ancient mystery schools of Thoth in Egypt and founded the Royal School of the Master Craftsmen at Karnak. At the time, they called them the Great White Brotherhood because of their preoccupation with a mysterious white powder. A branch of the fraternity became known as the Therapeutate. They were a healing community, so this had something to do with medicine as well. The Therapeutate, in fact, set up branches all over Palestine and Syria, and a branch of that Therapeutate were the Essenes at Qumran in the time of Jesus. So clearly, these guys were into this as well. Hathor. All of this is dedicated to Hathor, not to Jehovah. She was the great mother. She is the oldest identified deity figure of Egypt. She turns up on the oldest artifact ever known from 3000 odd BC. And her story, when it's being told in documented form, runs in parallel with a historical character called the great Vulcan, Tubal-Cain. Now, Tubal-Cain is actually mentioned in the Bible. Tubal-Cain was one of the descendants of Cain in the line from Eve. Tubal-Cain, even today, is revered by Freemasons worldwide. They don't know why. They just know that Tubal-Cain was very important and that Tubal-Cain was a master metallurgist. He was a great Vulcan. Now, Hathor's particularly interesting in Egypt because Hathor's not only there at the very beginning of Egyptian time, she's there at the very, very end of it. Right at the end of the Pharaonic era, when Queen Cleopatra is sort of winding down the whole thing and the Romans are moving in, and we're in about 30, 40 BC. She's the penultimate pharaoh of them all. Make sure that she has her one and only relief of her carved on the temple of Hathor. Hathor's a nursing goddess. Hathor was said to be the daughter of Ra. She was said to have given birth to the sun. She was the queen of the West. She was the one who knew the right spells, whatever they were. She was the protectress of womanhood, the lady of the sycamore, wine, tombs, song. But the importance of Hathor was that it was from the powdered milk of Hathor that the pharaohs gained their divinity. Now, we know now what the powdered milk of Hathor was. It was the powder being manufactured at the Hathor temple. They wondered at the time why this would not have been done in Egypt. But as I said earlier, Sinai was Egypt. It was the same country. It just happened to be the other side of the water. Now, one of the rock carvings by the cave at the mountain is a representation of Moses' own great-grandfather, Thutmose IV, in the presence of Hathor. And on this wonderful carved relief stands topped with lotus flowers and a man presenting Thutmose with a loaf of white bread. A conical loaf of white bread. Another stela details the mason, Ankib, offering 2 conical bread cakes to the king. And there are portrayals of this all throughout this temple, these bread cakes, the importance of the muskets, Hathor giving her divinity to the pharaoh. The man whose dynasty, and priests were dynastic as well as kings, the man whose dynasty went right through the government of this temple from the earliest times to the time even of Moses was a dynasty called Sobek-Hotep. And Sobek-Hotep is described as the overseer of the mountain and the overseer of the secrets of the house of gold. So there is no doubt whatever that we're dealing here with gold, and everything pointed to it as far as Petrie was concerned. But the Egypt Exploration Fund would have nothing to do with this. Reason being that in telling that story, which was a much more exciting story, we were not telling the story of the Ten Commandments and Moses and Jehovah on the mountain that the Bible told. Irrespective of the fact that this explains it better, this explains why they ended up on a mountain hundreds of miles off route, it's still better for them not to tell the story. Hathor was portrayed particularly by the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty. When you see their pictures, these old kingdom pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, Hathor is always there beside them. The 4th dynasty was the great dynasty of pyramid building. Pyramid building was directly related to this temple and the house of gold. That's how they got their name. The word Pyr, P-Y-R, means fire. Pyramid simply denotes something that is begotten by fire. Hathor is very important in the pyramid era. She's very important to the pharaohs of that era, the pharaohs that were said to have built the great pyramids of Giza. What was the link, I wondered? And I thought, well, I'm going to read these reports of Petrie. So I actually managed to get the reports to find out what was going on here. And Petrie was bothered by the same thing. He couldn't actually work out why this nursing goddess, this goddess whose milk gave the pharaoh's divinity, was associated with building pyramids. Well, the answer actually was very, very clear-cut. Under the right circumstances, this powder is perfectly capable of transposing its own aspects to other things. This powder, if you remember the Hudson experiments, actually had its own weightlessness. It was exotic matter. Now, one of the great researchers into gravity from the 1960s was the Russian physicist Sakharov. And he wrote a lot about gravity at a 0 point. And he said this powder is exotic matter. He explained that it had, under testing, a gravitational attraction of less than 0. It weighed not only nothing, but this powder could weigh less than nothing. It's wholly exotic, he said. This powder can be made to move into a different dimension if we want it to. Not only can it itself weigh less than nothing, but its host can weigh less than nothing. Now, if you remember again the Hudson talks, remember the pan? The powder was in the pan. Not only did the powder lose its weightlessness, but so does the pan. So what emerges from this is that actually it doesn't matter whether it's a pan or a saucer or an enormous great block of stone.